So welcome everybody to another episode of Collaborwocky, Modus Cooperandi and Modus Institute's web series in Lean Coffee on Humane Management. I'm Tonianne DeMaria, and with me as usual is my partner in collaboration and creation and continuous improvement, Jim Benson.
Hello.
So today we're here to discuss what for over a decade now has presented itself probably as our clients' greatest frustration. It's something that plagues all of us, especially those of us in knowledge work who rely primarily on our brains rather than our brawn to create a product or a service. And it's an issue that is perfectly encapsulated by this guy. So that's Max, or more precisely, that's 5-minute Max, because all Max ever seems to need is just 5 minutes of your time. And it's always when your head's down in the middle of something important, right? So now we've all been on the giving and the receiving side of this seemingly innocuous request. We've all been 5-minute Max. And now, thanks to the combination of the stress of a pandemic and the resulting quarantine and our distributed teams and networking tools that alert us and pop up in the middle of our desktop and ping us on our phones, distracting us, interrupting us nearly 24/7, today's knowledge workers' attention is arguably more fractured than ever. So while we're constantly confronting the siren's call of novelty and immediate gratification, and that's because of when something new is introduced into our otherwise stable environment, our brains are hardwired to pay attention to that novelty. So now acknowledging and responding to the unfamiliar or the unexpected isn't necessarily a bad thing, because exploration of novelty is how we learn, right? And perhaps more importantly, it's how we were able to survive as a species. But what does prove problematic about novelty in the context of knowledge work is that when it competes or compels us to shift our attention mid-task, and then naively we think that we could smoothly return to the task we first shifted our attention from. Because our brains are optimized to minimize risk and maximize reward, it's pretty much primed to detect and remember and project what kind of an outcome and novelty something that's seemingly unfamiliar, of seemingly unfamiliar presence in our environment will provide. So it causes us to stop what we're doing, and our brain diverts its resources to see, does this novelty pose a risk? Might it result in a potential reward? Are we going to get a dopamine and a serotonin burst from it? Will the immediate gratification be more fulfilling than the delayed payoff of whatever it is that I'm currently doing? And it basically stops us from whatever we're doing to go find those things out. And so back to Max and his 5 minutes. Not only do we know that the moment or the task being requested from us is never limited to just 5 minutes, because hello, planning fallacy and variation and people like Max who seem to never be able to stop talking. But we likewise know, and we also fear, that interruption is going to completely nuke our focus. And it's going to destroy not just our psychological flow, but by extension, any potential for operational flow that we would have. So from both a human and an organizational perspective, there's some really significant implications to these types of unnecessary interruptions. So just a quick aside, some of you know that Jim and I are notorious for not relying on a slide deck, and certainly not slides that are dominated by text. But there are just too many fascinating studies out there regarding the ramifications of interruptions not to show you this slide and not to share some of these high-level findings with you. So I'm sure that some of you have come across these or similar research. So while there might be some variance between the numbers and the percentages that you see there, the findings among interruption-related research are pretty consistent in that the consequences of time displaced by an interruption is across the board more cognitively draining and deleterious than the interruption itself often is. So Jim, okay, so you got that. So now, before we go any further, I want to actually point out that I was intentional before when I utilized the term unnecessary interruption. And that's because interruptions are often what drive knowledge work, in that much of what we do is emergent or interruption driven. So today, while we're going to be discussing the negative impacts of interruptions in general, and ways to minimize or eliminate those that we identify as unnecessary, we're also going to be discussing ways to understand and manage and make time for and even batch your more useful interruptions. So with that, let's start with what an interruption is. So regardless of it being necessary or unnecessary, essentially an interruption is when we're forced to disengage from an activity or a task or even a train of thought because of some type of external force or even an internal force. And we'll get to those in a moment. And you have the intention of returning to that primary task the moment that interruption is concluded. So one of the immediate consequences that takes place here is task switching. So to the left, that image might be familiar to many of you, especially in software. It's Jerry Weinberg's task switching graph. And it illustrates the costs of task switching, which is what we're likewise doing when we try to recover from an interruption, right? So knowledge work is primarily fueled by this, by the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, which is often referred to as the brain CEO. It's the part of the brain that's responsible for attention and self-control and working memory and goal setting and prioritization and decision making and problem solving, all of that higher level learning and or higher level thinking that involves our executive functions. And so when it comes to processing speed, the brain processes these types of high cognitive tasks sequentially, one at a time, one after the other. It does not process them in parallel. So yes, you can successfully engage in multiple low cognitive or physical tasks at the same time, like chewing gum while swinging a bat or warming a bottle on the stove while comforting a fussy baby on your shoulder. But tasks that involve that higher level thinking, it can't be done in parallel. So as Jerry's image shows us, when there's this temporary disruption in the workflow that's involving those higher level tasks, we incur not just a carryover cost from that primary task, but a ramp up cost for the second task, as well as for every successive task. So the more complex a task, like decision-making, problem solving, those executive function related tasks that I mentioned before, the more our cognitive ability is degraded by the previous task's residue. And that's a term and a concept I've come to appreciate that's attributed to a professor here at the University of Washington, Sophie Leroy. And her research, Professor Leroy's research supports Jerry's chart here as the more processing speed and quality that we sacrifice in that shift from one task to the next task to the next, the more that our attention is fractured. And the more we set off a work cycle that's nothing if not vicious. Simply because task switching, it then begets more task switching, not task completion, and certainly not, completing tasks with quality. So I'm going to pull this ticket into doing. So this is the Zygarnik ticket. In the personal Kanban book, we discussed a psychological, there's no slide for that, Jim. It's just a ticket. Yep. So let's see. Got it. Okay. So in the personal Kanban book, we discussed this psychological phenomenon known as the Zygarnik effect, where information and tasks that are left incomplete don't leave our mind, right? It's like when you're lying in bed at night, the things that keep you up are the things that you've not yet completed that you still have to do. So they don't leave our mind, but rather they cause us to ruminate on whatever it was that we left incomplete. And that results in intrusive thoughts, which then leave us more vulnerable to distractions. So the cognitive energy that task switching requires actually tasks our cognitive reserves, causing us distraction and frustration and burnout and stress, and it impedes our focus and it invites compounding error and rework, ultimately preventing us from realizing our optimal potential. Interruptions, they prevent us from completing work with quality, if not simply completing work at all. That's easy, we get that. But on a deeper level, there's something much more insidious at play here. And for that, we can look at positive psychology pioneer Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and his seminal work. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, Flow, the Psychology of Optimal Experience. And he was the first one really to identify that amazing, bordering on euphoric experience that we've all had at one time or another when we're completely engrossed in a task, that the work feels totally effortless, it's enjoyable, it's inspiring, we're so focused that we lose all sense of time and ego, and we just become these productivity machines. If you've heard Jim and I speak before, if you've taken any of our classes, you often hear us referring to the process we went through writing the personal Kanban book and pair writing, and how both of us found moments where we were just so absorbed in the work, we had achieved that sense of flow that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi refers to. So this psychological flow state, just like the flow of a river or a freeway, is only possible in the absence of impedance, right? Unnecessary interruptions are impedance. Interruptions, they prevent us from achieving deep and protracted states of concentration, right? Which is a prerequisite for flow. And as author Cal Newport explains in one of my favorite books of the last couple of years, Deep Work, he shares one of my favorite stories about staving off interruptions, which likewise shows that this is a very much human issue and not simply a tech-driven 21st century concern, which of course compounds the issue. So in Deep Work, he offers this he offers this great story of Carl Jung, all right, who a century ago knew that if his new school of thought on analytical psychology was ever going to be able to hold its own in a field that at the time had been dominated by Sigmund Freud, he had to take his psychology in an entirely, or his research in an entirely new direction. And he needed a place outside of his office and his home in this busy, bustling Zurich, where he could study and think uninterrupted and produce groundbreaking work with limited distractions. So what did Jung do? Well, he built a stone tower in the woods, in fact, to remove all social distractions. So Cal Newport, he was careful to point out that Jung's famous Bollingen Tower was not a holiday retreat. It wasn't some place where he would just escape from work, but rather he did the opposite. It was where Cal Newport, this is a direct quote from Cal Newport, he can have a brain boosting environment where he could take his work head on, straight on and further his theories. And given that even Freud saw him as his intellectual heir, obviously it worked. So our interruption-laden environment right now, it's not simply causing us to do, as Newport sees it, as shallow work, but what he argues and what we've seen that's much more frightening is it's reducing our ability to ever go deep, ever do deep work. So here we are in the 21st century. We know so much more about the human brain than we did 100 years ago. And we know how it's always scanning our environment for threats, whether they're physical or social, right? And among our survival instincts, we're primed to notice and pay attention to those threats because they're novelty, something that's out of the ordinary. And so oral, social, visual, even psychological or biological noise distracts us and interrupts us. So our distractions, our interruptions are not only 5-minute max. It's not only people. It's not only tech. It's also neural noise. It's also environmental. It's things like aroma. It's things like white noise. It's things like hunger pains, right? Those are things that distract us. And so we've gotten to the point that far too many of us, especially in knowledge work, have resigned ourselves to working in this unrelenting state of constant distraction, right? And we're working quite literally at this degraded mental capacity. And we're looking at it like this way of working is business as usual. But here's the thing, it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the individual because of the stress and the cortisol that it produces. It's not sustainable for the organization because that shallow work, it produces zero competitive edge for the organization. And it's not good for an economy or an age that's ostensibly driven by information, in which shallow thinking is not going to lead to any innovation that benefits society as a whole. So, so what do we do? How do we help our clients? How do we help ourselves function amid all of this? So at Modus, we tend to help design work systems, basically human operating systems, if you will. And what we do is we take into consideration the level and the extent to which unnecessary interruptions derail us or stress us out or downright sabotage our psychological and our operational flow, essentially our effectiveness. And these are mostly visual systems, and we're gonna take a look at a couple of them in a moment. And those visual systems are there to help us better understand and leverage opportunities that the more useful of those interruptions can present. So we need to be mindful of that. We need to be mindful that the systems that we work in need to help people focus on the work. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Jim.
All right, thank you. Interruptions are really crazy. And they're crazy because we tend to take them as personal attacks. So if I'm working and somebody comes up and 5-minute max comes up and says, hey, dude, 5 minutes, I pretty much immediately feel like Max has wronged me. He's like pulled me out of my flow state. He's frustrated me, and now I'm upset. And every class we teach, and there's a couple people on the call who have been through the classes, so they know this. One of the first things we do is an affinity mapping exercise where we get everybody in the room to write down all of the things that interrupt them or stop them from being able to do their work. And usually we'll fill up a big wall. This is in Iowa. This is one of those like conference centers that insists on putting felt on the walls so that sticky notes won't stick to it. You can imagine how annoying that is for Toni and me. So we had to build this little pen for all of the Post-it notes, which is why they're all stuck. Otherwise, it would take up the whole wall. But you can see right now that they're all like this color, this long line of this color. So we know that these are all individual gripes at the moment. Like this bugs me, this bugs me, this bugs me. And then we affinitize them. We move them into like groups like this. And there's Max's one. You can see another that there's a group behind it. That when we do that, people see now they get alignment around the fact that interruptions aren't actually an individual phenomenon. They're a group phenomenon. They are your group, which includes your team, the people who work with your team, the people you work for. Those who would interrupt you rarely do so for no reason. They're usually looking for information. They're trying to get something done. They're trying to get you to get something done. There is some reason for it. And so we tend to think of our work as this is my ticket. I'm doing this, but there's always someone you're doing it for. There's always people you're doing it with. That leads to interruptions if you don't have a system to work with. If you haven't set up a social system for you, your team, where people know what information is located where and where to get it and when they need to update that information. So the first picture I'll show here is from one of the original lean thinkers of the world, probably the best lean thinker in the world. And that's Julia Child. So this wall right now is actually in the Smithsonian Institution. I took a picture of this at the Smithsonian, and this was cut out of her kitchen. Actually, they cut the whole kitchen out of her house and moved the kitchen to the Smithsonian. But she had all of her cooking equipment up on pegboards, so she knew immediately where to get it. In Lean, they call this 5S. It's really hard to 5S for your brain. And frankly, it's taken Tonianne and I a long time to actually realize that that's a big part of what we're doing when we do these things. So if we set up, this kind of normal looking Kanban here, you see that even this Kanban has a ready, a doing, and a done, and there's some stuff going on in it, but you see that there's other information that they need up here as part of their standard work. So I know I said this in previous episodes of Collaborwocky, but no Kanban ever is effective alone. It's more effective than not having one, but it's not actually it's not going to get rid of your interruptions like you'd like it to. So this is a Kanban that one of the teams that we worked with man, I'm just bringing everything to front here, aren't I? And I know this is hard to read, but up here, this column, this is their big done column, but this one is called communicate me. And so they move a task over here when it's done, but between there, they have to satisfy this stuff. And if they don't, if some of those things aren't satisfied, those things are noted in this column, and they either talk about it in their huddle, daily, stand-up, whatever you want to call it, or they talk about it in their retrospective. But they make sure that this communication happens in a way that's visual and not in a way that is, hey, do you have 5 minutes for this task? Okay. So, oops, I'm not in click on it mode anymore. So how do we think of interruptions? So what we tell our clients, and when we're working with people, we're like, so the first thing we want to know is, what are the interruptions you have? So we get them to write them down, so all these things are interruptions, and they've written them down. And then, is it worth it? And then, was it necessary? And those two questions sound like they might be the same thing, but they're not. They're actually quite different. So one of the things that we'll do with people initially is we'll say, okay, you know what? I want you to lay out your stuff as you do it. This is now over here. We'll have like my interruptions column. And when you get interrupted, you say, was this worth my time, or was it worth their time, or both? So you always want, when you're analyzing something, to have more than one perspective. Because only one perspective is confirmation bias, straight up. So we say, was it worth my time? Was it worth their time? Okay, and we can see right now that at the beginning, people think that almost nothing was worth their time. Almost all interruptions are just annoyances, and we don't like them, and they should go away. We will grudgingly admit that they might be worth other people's time. So when you get down to these things that aren't worth my time, but are worth other people's time, a lot of those end up being status check-ins. They end up being like specific direction for maybe a new hire or things like that. And then when you see these blobs, you realize that there's probably standard work to communicate that information in a way that currently is ineffective. It doesn't mean that the need isn't real. The need for the status check-in is real, because you haven't created a system to provide that in a way that isn't an interruption. And when you don't provide a system for constantly needed information to not be an interruption, it will be an interruption. That's Benson's new law of enforced interruptions. Just came up with it now. So again, if you don't come up with a system for information exchange, when people need that information, their only hope is to interrupt you by email, by Slack, by stopping by your desk, by calling you on the phone, by sending you a text message, by sending you food via Grubhub with a silly name so that you're thinking about them, anything. So we want to start looking at these things, and then also recognize that, okay, these interruptions here, totally worth my time and totally worth their time. That means that these interruptions up here were probably meetings that you forgot to schedule. They're working sessions, they're collaborations that you forgot to schedule, and so they became an interruption. So your team, through all these interruptions, your team is processing information in order to create good product. And if we go back to Toni's slide of wisdom here, that all of this is telling us that there is a really, really high amount of overhead. There's an incredible penalty. There is an incredible opportunity cost that we pay for not coming up with some agreement with the people that we work with about how we work, about how we get together. So let's go take a look at how we're working right now. This is our current, what we call our Obeya. Right now, we're working on a variety of things. We're working on Collaborwocky episodes, on newsletters, on blog posts, on marketing, on speaking, and oh, look at that. Here's the stuff from this week. Okay, I can mark this one done. So what is this that this means? This means that right now, if I zoom out, I can see that the black things are things that are in progress or done. I can see that pink and yellow things are things that I need to, or that Tonianne actually needs to take a look at. The orange things, which actually are mostly living over here in this thing, these are things I need to pay attention to. So this is updating our value stream mapping class. Why does it look like this and it doesn't look like left to right Kanban? It looks like this because of what's going on down here. Okay. some of these are just tasks, but other things in here are conversations. And what we were finding was that we had a lot of conversations going on about all of our products simultaneously. And when we were just using a Kanban, we were interrupting each other all the time because the Kanban ticket itself wasn't robust enough to handle that exchange of information. And so when teams are working on large, complex projects, there's a lot of information flowing back and forth that is hidden in any type of Kanban system, or not talked about at all in a traditional Agile system. And we need to have those conversations. And then here, Tonianne even has notes for me saying, these are done, just wanted to let you know what I did to them while I was working on them. So that's how that looks for us. How does that look for other people? Well, we already saw how it looked for the grand dame of cooking, but let's see how it looks. This is, some people have seen other visions of this room before from Turner Construction, but this board is used on a multi-billion-dollar project, or I guess $1 billion project to be more precise. And here's the cool thing. So we talked about their weird vertical Kanban before, and you can see it's working for them. They've got lots of information. Also up here, they've got information that's flowing it's flowing through time. These are each months, and these are milestones that happen in the months. It's very difficult to talk about when this work happens if you're not looking at the dates by which they're needed. It's just that simple. So their board does need time information. That time information doesn't necessarily need to be displayed in the same visual control as the work that's being done. Now, the cool thing about it is over here, this is a visual control, and I'll be honest with you, I have no memory of what it was. This is several years ago. But what I can tell you is that right now, all of these people are actively involved with this temporary visual control. So there is a decision that needs to be made, some information that needs to be processed, that they are storing in this visual control. And now when they're sitting on the other side of this wall at their desks, they're not bugging each other about information about it. They can just come in and look at it. The visual system provides the social system with the information that it needs, such that it doesn't have to interrupt other people. Okay. Here are two more. This is a different group, or actually the same group. They do a regular exercise with the trades that are working on the site. So at this point, you can't see it here, but there's actually 9 trades working on the site. In construction, people die. They get hit by stuff, they fall off of stuff, they trip over stuff, they get hurt a lot. And it's very important for the general contractor, for Turner, to make sure that people don't get hurt, that the work gets done right the first time, and that it gets done in time so that the client's happy and that everybody, makes their money. So they get all 9 of those trades together in the room, and they map out what work is coming up, not so that they can build a Kanban out of it, but so they can figure out the collaborative relationships between the people who are going to be on a particular floor, in a particular building, using a particular loading dock, having access to particular resources, that they're not in each other's way, that there is a flow to the work, that the choreography of what's happening on the site is set up in a way that is copacetic. This visual control was actually Tonianne and me planning a new course. And what we have here are statements that we'd like to make, these yellow ones, and surrounding the statements are specific psychological constructs that enable or disable human beings from doing these things. And then the pink stickies are visualizations or other tools that we can use to overcome these psychological constructs so that we can get these things done. When we set this up, it grew kind of organically. There was a lot of things that were moving around. But then after that, now we had the images of this. And then the images of that became the basis for the plan of the work that we did. And while we were doing that work, the images further kept us grounded so that we didn't have to ask ourselves, what did we think about this? Or what did we think about that? So this was a planning tool that became a memory aid. And do you remember ... is a pretty freaking major interruption that you're going to get. So these are ways that we handle interruptions, but the core of all of this is, do we know what information we need, and have we set up a situation to make sure that we don't have to physically ask each other for it? Maybe I could have just said that, but so you want to close up there, Toni, and take us into the
conversation? Sure. One of the things that we talk about is how interruptions are always preventing us from, getting our work done. But I found this quote by C.S. Lewis: "We must stop regarding unpleasant or unexpected things as interruptions of real life. The truth." Thanks, Jim.
Oh, sorry.
Jim just interrupted me.
I did just interrupt you.
As I was, we must stop regarding unpleasant or unexpected things as interruptions of real life. The truth is that interruptions are real life. Now, was there a lack of value in what Jim just did? No, it made me laugh. It was an interruption that was funny. It showed you that we have psychological safety with each other. It shows us that, we're human. But something over the past couple of weeks has compelled me to really start paying attention to the interruptions we have, and not to always dismiss them. Because over the past couple of months, I have had one consistent interruption in my office that has been pretty amazing. And it's actually helped me with my deep work. And if Jim, you want to pull that up? I've had these little guys tapping on my window. That's a
real picture, by the way, everybody. That's not like she can get that off the web. She does these things.
It's not a bad interruption to have in life. So yes, interruptions can push us off our game, but they could also open us up to new learnings, new experiences, new adventures. So just be mindful of where they're coming from, how you feel about them, and then figure out a way to either get rid of them or to leverage them. So with that, I wanted to open up this call to the rest of you. If anybody has any comments or wants to ask any questions, you can either do so in the Lean Coffee table. I left a link in the chat.
I just put it back in.
Just raise your hand over here. It's perfectly fine if you want to do that over here as well. So with that, there's a little raise hand, or you could just, let's see, yeah.
All right. Okay, so I see people are coming into the Lean Coffee board. So just type in any topics that you want to talk about into the board and we'll get started.
I did want to share something. Somebody was signing up for this, and they said, "I'm really glad that you're having a conversation about this, because I'm having a bear of a time with technology right now." And she's like, I have willpower. And I laughed when I heard the term willpower, because it reminded me of a story that Jim and I, one of our last engagements, we were teaching an in-person class, and one of the students was trying to grasp a new concept. It was a concept called Kanban, Dave Snowden's sense-making model. And it's a fairly complex model that we were introducing, and his mobile phone kept sending him alerts non-stops. The alerts kept lighting up and his screen kept lighting up, and he'd pick up his phone and he would look at his notifications, rinse, repeat, right? Until finally he turned over his phone. He noticed we were all watching him. He turned over his phone. He placed it behind like some book on a table, like a couple of inches away, ostensibly so that he wouldn't be distracted anymore. But the phone, of course, continued to buzz, right? And I smiled, and again, thinking, willpower. And delayed gratification is super hard for a brain that optimizes for two things, right? To minimize risk and to maximize reward. Try it sometime. See what a Herculean effort it is not to check your phone after it's spent an hour alerting you to, whatever potential dread is happening on TV or on Facebook. I don't recommend it. So the invocation of willpower. I understand that, but the brain's like a child. It's incessantly vying for our attention to get what it needs. And so in that moment, despite any attempt at willpower, this student's attention was already depleted. It was ruminating on what his alerts could possibly mean, on who was calling, on who was texting, on who needed him. It was that Zeigarnik effect that was in action here. So, after reading Deep Work, that was probably one of the habits that I was able to really focus on over the past year and a half, and it's helped me. I no longer have any push notifications on my phone or on my desktop, with the exception of Slack for Jim and Dave and Alan and the rest of Modus. That's it. And I am amazed at how I no longer have the need to scroll, that my focus has gotten so much stronger over the past year, simply because of that one little tweak. So I would caution anybody against relying on willpower, and instead kind of architect your environment, get the phone out of reach, so that it does not tempt you. So, okay. All right. So we have a question that came in. My team has 500 ways to exchange information. They all end up being interruptions. We lose stuff. Excellent. How can we get some focus? Jim, you didn't talk about the calm agreement, did you?
I did not. So right. So let me actually I still am sharing my screen. Let me go to Toni's board here really quick. So this was what Toni was using off screen when she said, I'm moving tickets. I didn't, because I was moving stuff around, but that meant that I missed this one. So one of the things that we do with every team that we work with is we come up with a communications plan. And what that communications plan or communications agreement does is it says, what information does the team need? What information do you need as a professional? What do we need to work together? What are all the technologies that we have that are at our disposal? Where do we currently lose information? What information doesn't get updated? And then we can compare that to their value stream map. And we can say, okay, here's where you need specific information to actually get your work done, and you don't have that. So software teams are notoriously bad at documenting what they've done. So a lot of this for software comes back to just documentation. But for most teams in the real world, this comes down to like actually state information about a given contract, a specific client, a specific thing that you're building. And so we will say, okay, we're now as a team going to agree this information goes here, this information goes here, this information goes here. So when we started building an Obeya where these conversations, so let's put it this way. When we first started doing Kanban, state information conversations dropped dramatically. When we started using instant messenger and then later Slack, short questions stopped happening face-to-face and started to happen asynchronously or more asynchronously in chat. When we set up this, all of those conversations stopped. So like the crazy thing now is like in Slack, we get notifications that people do things on Modus Institute, or that we've made a sale, or that we need to talk to somebody. But we hardly talk to each other in Slack anymore, but we talk to each other here in the Obeya where the work actually happens, where our goals are clear, and where we're keeping track of multiple states of multiple things and still holding true to limiting our work in progress. So now we, the only time Toni or Dave or Alan or I will email each other is when we're forwarding an email someone else sent. We only talk to each other in Slack when we're saying like, are we going to have a huddle today? Do we need to work on this right now? Hey, look at this, or memes. It's kind of become our own internal Facebook. So our internal plan said, we value the conversations that we're having. We want to make sure that those conversations happen with the least impedance possible. And that's how this was created.